The paper silver market is mathematically scheduled to die in March 2026, not because of a tweet, not because of inflation fear, because the physical metal required to settle the March futures contract does not exist in the vault. Most people still view silver as a precious metal, a speculative coin, a hedge against currency collapse. That belief is the official narrative designed to keep you looking at the wrong side of the trade. You see, on November 6, 2025, the United States Geological Survey added silver to the critical minerals list under the Energy Act of 2020. Silver is now classified alongside rare earths, lithium, and cobalt as a strategic material vital to national security, which means the metal you thought was just shiny insurance is now a weapon-grade input for missile guidance systems, solar infrastructure, and fifth-generation warfare electronics. Today, I'm breaking down the three-stage collapse mechanism: the inventory drain, the Project Vault seizure protocol, and the March 2026 maturity wall that ends the paper illusion. A mandatory protocol before we open the file. This is not financial advice. I'm not a licensed advisor. The math follows a script, but your capital is your responsibility. Always conduct your own research. The trap was set on February 2nd, 2026. The United States Export-Import Bank announced a $12 billion strategic reserve program called Project Vault, $10 billion in federal credit, $1.67 billion in private capital from institutional partners. The stated goal was to build a civilian stockpile of critical minerals to prevent supply chain collapse during the next geopolitical fracture. The real goal was to lock physical silver before the March contract delivery crunch exposes the paper leverage pyramid. You see, the participants in Project Vault are not small businesses or retail hedgers. General Motors, Boeing, Google. These entities consume over 80 million ounces of silver annually for electric vehicle components, aerospace-grade circuits, and data center infrastructure, which means they are not buying futures contracts. They are pulling registered physical inventory directly from the exchange-approved warehouses, the same warehouses that are supposed to back the March contract. Plus, the timeline is surgical. Project Vault was announced 39 days after silver was added to the critical minerals list. The first drawdowns began 12 days later. By mid-February, industrial participants had already claimed access to an estimated 15 million ounces of registered COMEX inventory. The math is clinical. If industrial demand continues at current velocity, the exchange will enter March 2026 with less than 20 million ounces of deliverable metal to satisfy a contract representing 500 million ounces of open interest. That is a 25-to-1 leverage ratio. The paper price reflects abundance. The vault reflects scarcity. And when the delivery demand hits on February 27th, first notice day, the gap becomes visible. Now, if this $12 billion vault just shifted your understanding of what silver actually is in 2026, or you want to track these strategic mineral shifts as they accelerate, join the Forensic Circle by hitting subscribe. The next phase gets darker. But even this institutional seizure is a distraction from the real kill shot hidden in the January 1st export licensing rules out of Beijing. Because while Washington was building a vault, China was closing the warehouse door on 70% of the world's refined silver supply. And what they did with 44 approved export firms rewrites the entire delivery timeline for March. The smoking gun is not a conspiracy. It is a balance sheet. As of late January 2026, the COMEX registered silver inventory, the physical metal available for delivery against futures contracts, stood at approximately 30 million ounces. Registered inventory is the only category that matters. Eligible inventory sits in the warehouse but is not pledged for delivery. It is metal that could theoretically be converted to registered status, but conversion requires the owner's consent. And in a delivery crunch, consent disappears, which means the exchange has 30 million ounces to cover delivery demand. Now, the March 2026 silver contract has open interest representing roughly 500 million ounces. You see, most futures contracts are closed before delivery. Traders roll positions, speculators take profit. The system is designed on the assumption that physical delivery will never be demanded at scale, but the math in 2026 is different. If only 20% of contract holders stand for delivery, demand physical metal instead of cash settlement, the exchange needs 100 million ounces. It has 30 million. That is not a supply squeeze. That is a structural default written into the ledger 6 weeks before first notice day. Plus, the leverage ratio is now visible to every institutional desk with access to the Commitments of Traders report. The 16-to-1 ratio between open interest and registered inventory is not hidden data. It is public, it is archived, and it is accelerating, which means the entities with the capital to demand delivery are already positioning. The February 13th edition of the COT report showed a net long position among managed money accounts of over 90,000 contracts. Each contract represents 5,000 ounces. That is 450 million ounces of synthetic demand held by funds with the balance sheet capacity to take physical settlement. The exchange cannot print metal. It can only settle in cash if the contract holder agrees to cash. And under COMEX Rule 402, If a clearing member fails to deliver on a contract, the buyer can demand the metal at market price plus 20% penalty. Now, here is where the math becomes irreversible. On January 28, 2026, the CME Group, the entity that operates COMEX, raised initial margin requirements on silver futures by 18%. The official reason was increased volatility. The real reason was to reduce speculative long positions before the delivery window opens. Margin hikes do not reduce physical demand. They reduce paper speculation, which means the exchange is clearing out the noise to prepare for the entities that will actually stand for delivery. You see, margin hikes were used in 1980 to crush the Hunt brothers. They worked because the Hunt brothers were leveraged speculators using borrowed capital. When margin requirements doubled, they could not post collateral, and their positions were liquidated. But in 2026, the entities standing for delivery are not speculators. They are industrial consumers with federal credit lines and strategic stockpile mandates. General Motors does not care if margin requirements rise by 18%. They are not trading on leverage. They are converting futures contracts into physical inventory to meet battery production quotas under the Inflation Reduction Act. Boeing does not care about volatility. They need silver for aerospace-grade circuit boards to fulfill Department of Defense contracts that are already 6 months behind schedule. Google does not care about speculative sentiment. They are securing metal for data center expansion tied to artificial intelligence infrastructure build-out across 14 states, which means the margin hike strategy that worked in 1980 is now irrelevant. The buyers are capitalized, the demand is structural, and the vault is empty. Plus, the exchange has no mechanism to force cash settlement if the buyer refuses. Under Section 5A of the COMEX rulebook, a contract holder has the legal right to demand physical delivery as long as the contract is held through first notice day. First notice day for the March contract is February 27, 2026. That is the day the clearing members must declare whether they intend to deliver metal or settle in cash. And if the clearing member cannot deliver, the contract holder can file a notice of default and demand immediate physical settlement at prevailing market price. The exchange has 30 million ounces. The demand could exceed 100 million ounces within 72 hours of first notice day. Now, the official narrative will tell you that most contracts will be rolled into the May contract, that traders will take profit, that the market will self-regulate. But the data does not support that narrative. The iShares Silver Trust, ticker SLV, recorded net inflows for 169 consecutive trading days as of mid-February 2026. That is the longest inflow streak in the fund's history. Institutional money is not speculating. It is converting paper exposure into metal-backed claims, which means the entities with the capital to move markets are already treating silver as a strategic asset, not a speculative trade. Plus, the February 2nd launch of Project Vault created a legal precedent. If the federal government is using taxpayer-backed credit to secure civilian silver reserves, it signals to every institutional participant that physical scarcity is now a policy variable, not a market variable. The vault is a national security protocol. And once silver is classified as a critical mineral under the Energy Act of 2020, the price mechanism becomes subordinate to the supply allocation mechanism. You see, Bloomberg published a forecast on January 9th, 2026, calling for silver to mean revert to $50 per ounce by mid-year. The report cited oversupply in base metals and softening industrial demand in Europe. That forecast is the official trap. It is designed to flush retail holders before the delivery crunch. It anchors public sentiment to a mean reversion thesis, while institutional participants are quietly converting futures exposure into registered inventory claims. The math is forensic. Bloomberg's $50 target assumes supply abundance, but the COMEX warehouse data shows 6 consecutive months of registered inventory decline. The supply is contracting, the demand is fixed, and the March contract is the mathematical intersection where the paper illusion meets the physical scarcity, which means the mean reversion call is not a forecast. It is a sentiment anchor designed to suppress buying pressure until after the industrial entities have locked their delivery positions. The leverage is terminal, the vault is empty, and the March contract is not a speculative event. It is a delivery reckoning written into the forward curve 6 months ago. But even this delivery math is incomplete without understanding the historical precedent. Because in 1980, the last time silver leverage broke this badly, it was speculative mania that triggered the collapse. In 2026, it is industrial necessity, and the difference between those two forces rewrites the endgame entirely. Let me show you the historical autopsy. The last time silver leverage collapsed this violently was 1980. Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt, 2 Texas oil heirs, attempted to corner the silver market by accumulating futures contracts and demanding physical delivery. At the peak, they controlled roughly 100 million ounces of physical silver and held derivatives exposure representing another 200 million ounces. The price spiked from $6 per ounce in January 1979 to $50 per ounce by January 1980. Then the exchange changed the rules. On January 21st, 1980, the COMEX Board of Governors imposed Silver Rule 7. The rule restricted new long positions and raised margin requirements by over 300% within 2 weeks. The Hunt brothers could not post the additional collateral. Their positions were liquidated. The price collapsed to $10 per ounce by March. The system survived because the leverage was speculative. The Hunt brothers were using borrowed capital to manipulate a commodity they did not need. When the margin calls hit, they folded. But the math in 2026 is inverted. The leverage is industrial. The buyers are not speculators gambling on a price spike. They are manufacturers securing input materials to meet federal production mandates and Department of Defense contract deadlines. You see, General Motors is not cornering the market. They are converting futures into physical inventory because the Inflation Reduction Act requires them to source 30% of battery componentry from domestic or allied supply chains by 2027. Silver is a mandatory input for electric vehicle battery management systems. Boeing is not speculating. They are hedging supply risk because their aerospace contracts include penalty clauses for delayed delivery. Silver is required for high-frequency circuit boards and avionics systems. Google is not trading. They are securing metal because their data center expansion depends on silver-based thermal interface materials that cannot be substituted with copper or aluminum at the required performance threshold. Which means, when the CME raised margin requirements by 18% on January 28, 2026, it did not reduce physical demand. It cleared out the retail noise and isolated the industrial buyers who have federal credit backing and no intention of rolling their positions into May. The margin hike that killed the Hunt brothers in 1980 is irrelevant in 2026 because the capital structure is inverted. The buyers are not leveraged. The exchange is. Plus, the historical parallel breaks entirely when you overlay the export control framework that did not exist in 1980. On January 1st, 2026, the People's Republic of China implemented a new export licensing regime for antimony, gallium, germanium, and refined silver under the Export Control Law of 2020. The law requires any entity exporting these materials to obtain a license from the Ministry of Commerce. Only 44 firms were granted licenses in the first approval cycle. You see, China controls between 60 and 70% of globally traded refined silver. They are the dominant processor of raw silver ore into the high-purity ingots required for industrial applications, which means 70% of the world's refined silver supply now passes through a regulatory choke point controlled by Beijing. The licensing regime is surgical. It does not ban exports. It throttles them. And throttling is more effective than an outright ban because it creates the illusion of market continuity while supply quietly disappears. Plus, the timing is forensic. The export licensing rules took effect on January 1st. Project Vault was announced on February 2nd. The margin hike hit on January 28th. And first notice day for the March contract is February 27th. The sequence is a controlled demolition of the paper price mechanism. You see, industrial consumption of silver has been running a structural deficit for 6 consecutive years. Global mine production is approximately 800 million ounces per year. Industrial consumption exceeds 1 billion ounces per year when you include solar panel manufacturing, electronics and medical devices, and electric vehicle components. Solar alone consumes over 200 million ounces annually. And solar installation capacity is projected to increase by 40% in 2026 under the global net zero commitments signed at the Brisbane G20 summit in 2024, which means demand is not discretionary. It is mandated by international climate treaties and domestic energy policy. The deficit has been backfilled by above-ground inventory held in exchange warehouses, central bank vaults, and private bullion reserves. But those inventories are finite, and in 2026 they are being drawn down at a velocity that exceeds the rate of new mine supply. Plus, the deficit is accelerating. In 2025, the Silver Institute estimated a structural supply shortfall of 215 million ounces. In 2026, the deficit is projected to exceed 250 million ounces due to increased solar deployment and electric vehicle production ramps in the United States, Europe, and India. You see, the Hunt brothers collapsed because they were fighting the exchange in a supply-abundant environment. The COMEX had access to global refined silver from Mexico, Peru, Canada, and Australia. When the margin calls hit, the Hunts were forced to liquidate, and the exchange could source replacement inventory from the open market. But in 2026, the exchange cannot source replacement inventory because the open market is controlled by a licensing regime that limits export flow to 44 approved firms, which means if a clearing member defaults on delivery, the exchange cannot simply buy metal on the spot market to cover the obligation. The metal is not available at any price that preserves the integrity of the futures curve. The China export trap is the inversion of the Hunt brothers precedent. In 1980, the exchange had supply access and used margin hikes to break the speculative buyers. In 2026, the buyers have capital and federal credit, and the exchange has no supply access. The leverage is terminal, the vault is empty, and the March contract is not a speculative mania. It is a delivery default written into the forward curve by a licensing regime that went live on January 1st. Now, the official narrative will tell you that silver is fungible, that if China restricts exports, the West will simply source from Peru or Mexico or Australia. But the data does not support that narrative. Refined silver is not raw ore. It is a high-purity industrial input that requires specialized smelting and refining infrastructure. China controls the refining capacity. Peru produces raw ore. Mexico produces raw ore. But without access to Chinese refining infrastructure, that ore cannot be converted into deliverable-grade ingots within the March contract timeline. The supply chain is not diversified. It is concentrated. And concentration creates a single point of failure that cannot be bypassed with capital or political will. The math is forensic. The March contract is the collision point, and the historical parallel to 1980 is inverted at every structural layer. Re-hook transition, which brings us to the final question. If the vault is empty, the demand is fixed, and the export choke point is active. What happens on February 27th, when First Notice Day forces the clearing members to declare delivery? Because the answer is not a price spike. It is a protocol shift that ends the paper market entirely. Let me show you the terminal sequence. On February 27th, 2026, the clearing members must declare delivery or cash settlement for the March silver contract. The COMEX has 30 million ounces of registered inventory. The open interest represents 500 million ounces of potential delivery demand. And the industrial buyers standing for delivery have federal credit lines that do not require margin. The math is no longer debatable. Most people will ignore this timeline and pay the price in March. They will trust the official narrative. They will believe the mean reversion forecast. And they will hold paper contracts that settle in cash, while the physical metal is allocated to entities with strategic stockpile mandates. But if you refuse to be a victim of the script, if you recognize that silver is no longer a speculative trade, but a weapon-grade strategic input under federal seizure protocol, then subscribe to join the Forensic Circle. We track the vault data, the export licensing updates, and the delivery default signals as they print in real time. The vault is empty, the demand is fixed, and by March, the paper illusion of price will meet the physical reality of zero inventory. The iShares Silver Trust recorded inflows for 169 consecutive days. The institutions are not speculating. They are converting exposure into metal-backed claims before the delivery window closes. The leverage is terminal, the export choke point is active, and the March contract is not a market event. It is a protocol shift. The paper-silver market dies in 2026 because the system was always designed to collapse when industrial necessity collides with speculative abundance. You were told it was a precious metal. The law now calls it a critical mineral, and the difference between those two classifications is the difference between a functioning futures market and a delivery default that cannot be papered over with margin hikes or cash settlement offers. The vault is empty. The clock is counting down. And February 27th is not a prediction. It is a deadline written into the forward curve 6 months ago.